History remembers the Vikings as unstoppable, the wolves of the north whose ships darkened every horizon. But what if I told you there was a place even they feared? A frozen realm not marked on maps, but etched in their nightmares. In these shadowed forests, they didn't sing songs of conquest. They whispered. Because here, in the land of snow and silence, the hunters became the hunted, and the ghosts they feared were very, very real. For nearly 3 centuries, the sight of a longship on the horizon meant one thing: terror. From the misty shores of Ireland to the sunlit rivers of Constantinople, a single name sent shivers through kings and peasants alike: the Vikings. These were not merely raiders or pirates, they were a force of nature, ruthless, brilliant, unstoppable. They came with the storm and left with fire. Born in the harsh fjords and icy coasts of Scandinavia, the Vikings were forged by survival. Their world offered no comfort, only cold, wind, and war, so they became hard, cunning, relentless. From childhood, Norse sons were trained in the blade, the code of honor, and the hunger for legacy. Glory wasn't a dream, it was a duty. Yes, they were warriors, but also engineers, explorers, poets. Their long ships, sleek, symmetrical, terrifying, were the apex predators of the sea. Fast, quiet, and able to land on any shore, they made the Vikings the first truly amphibious threat in history. One day they were a rumor, the next they were in your village. And violence? It wasn't a last resort. It was their language, and they were fluent. They raided monasteries to shatter the illusion of divine protection. They torched cities not just to win, but to send a message. Nowhere is safe. Their shield walls were serpents, scales locked tight, coiled to strike. Behind them came the berserkers, warriors who didn't fear death because they believed it guaranteed eternal life. And yet, despite their brutality, they were builders too. Dublin, Kiev, Novgorod, all bore their fingerprints. They opened trade routes, served kings, shaped laws. They were feared, but also admired. Their stories echoed across Europe, not just in screams, but in songs. To the world, the Vikings were predators. But even predators have nightmares. There was one frontier they could not bend. One place they could not conquer, a land of ice, of silence, of watchers in the woods. They called it Biamians, the white forest, the edge of the world. And what lived there? Did not fear death, did not run, did not speak, because they didn't need to. Their message was written in blood and silence. The Biamians were not kings or clans. They were shadows, a people so ancient, so alien, that even the fiercest Norse would whisper their name, not shout it. And when the Vikings entered their woods, they did not return. Before we tell that story of how silence defeated steel, you must understand the height of Viking power, because only then can you understand the depth of their fear and the power it takes to make the fearless run. Have you ever stood in a forest after snowfall? Not the kind that children play in, but the deep, ancient woods where silence becomes a second skin, where the air is so cold it burns your lungs, where every branch groans under the weight of ice, and the only sound is your own breath. Now imagine walking into that silence as a Viking, a warrior, proud and brutal, hardened by war, but unfamiliar with this kind of cold, this kind of stillness. You've crossed oceans, sacked kingdoms, faced armies head on, and yet here, your sword feels heavier, your instincts flicker, and for the first time in your life, you're not the one being hunted. You don't see them. You never will. But they see you. They are there, just beyond the tree line, moving without sound, breathing in rhythm with the forest, watching, waiting, measuring the weight of your fear. They are the Biamians. And to the Norse, they weren't just enemies, they were something worse. Uncategorizable, not warriors, not men, not beasts, something in between, something the sagas struggle to describe, something that made fire-hardened raiders tremble like children in the dark. The Vikings called them watchers in the white forest, because when you crossed into their land, you didn't hear war horns, you didn't see armies, you saw nothing and felt everything. The dread began slowly, a sense of being observed, of being unwelcome. The trees seemed too still, the snow too undisturbed, the silence too loud. Then small things, tracks that led nowhere, whispers carried on wind, landmarks that shifted subtly, just enough to disorient. Then someone goes missing, just a scout at first, then a sentry. No cries, no signs of struggle, just gone. Then in the morning, a body is found, frozen in the snow, eyes open, mouth sealed, no blood, no wounds, just a single clean slit across the neck. made by a blade too thin for war, but too precise to be luck. That's when the warriors stop talking. That's when the fear sets in, because the Vikings, who fought to be seen, to be feared, to be sung about, were now facing an enemy that did not care to be known. The Biamians had no interest in glory, only survival, only silence. And in that silence, they became something greater than soldiers. They became good. But these ghosts were not born from myth. They were engineered by nature. While the Vikings tamed the sea, the Biamians tamed the forest. They knew every tree, every snowfall, every sound the wind could make. They wore cloaks of white fur, not for warmth, but for invisibility. Their boots whispered over crusted snow. Their shelters disappeared into the land, half-submerged lodges, fire pits that left no smoke. They lived like phantoms, and when they fought like shadows. They didn't charge. They appeared. They didn't defend. They dissolved. They didn't conquer. They endured. The forest was not their home. It was their weapon. To a Viking, raised on coastlines and open fields, this was a different battlefield, one that punished strength, where shields were useless, where fire meant death. And worse than the ambushes was the waiting, because the Biamians didn't need to kill in the first hour or the first day. They let the forest do most of the work. The cold crept in, hunger set in, minds unraveled, until one by one, even the fiercest began to flinch at the crack of a branch, the howl of wind, the feeling, always the feeling that something was watching. Some Vikings called them demons, others witches. Most said nothing, because how do you fight what you can't see? How do you kill what doesn't bleed? How do you win against those who've made your fear their finest weapon? And that's what the Biamians understood, better than any general or king, that fear can kill faster than any sword, that silence is a strategy, that patience is a weapon, that knowing the land is more powerful than owning it. And the Vikings, who lived by conquest, found themselves undone by stillness. No shield walls, no challenges, no mercy, just snow, and something moving just outside the corner of your eye. The sagas don't talk much about these defeats, but they exist in whispers, in runes, in half-burned accounts of expeditions that never returned. One stone found near Trondheim reads simply, "We walked into the forest, only the forest walked out." That's what the Biamians did. They turned their home into a mirror, one that didn't reflect Viking glory, but Viking limits. And that, more than battle, more than bloodshed, is what made them legendary. Because in the age of axe and flame, it was the snow that won. War has always been loud. It is the clash of steel, the roar of warriors, the cries of the dying. It is fire and fury and chaos. It is meant to overwhelm the senses, bludgeon the enemy into fear and retreat. But what happens when war loses its voice? When there are no battle horns, no marching drums, no declarations of glory? Only silence. A silence that suffocates, a silence that waits. This was the battlefield of the Biamians. And the Vikings, so used to triumphing through sheer force, walked straight into it, unaware that they had already lost the moment they entered the trees. You see, the Norse were masters of open warfare. Their tactics were built on speed, aggression, and spectacle. They struck fast, struck hard, and left ruin in their wake. Their strength was physical, their power psychological. Their name alone was a weapon. But in the forests of the far north, their entire way of war unraveled because the Biamians didn't fight back. Not the way the Vikings expected. They didn't meet them in open fields. They didn't stand in lines or raise banners. They didn't give speeches or name champions. They didn't even speak. Instead, they watched. They waited. And they made sure every step the Vikings took led deeper into confusion, exhaustion, and fear. This was a different kind of war, a war of shadows. To the Biamians, victory didn't mean killing the most enemies. It meant never being caught, never being seen. It meant disrupting, disorienting, and dismantling the enemy's will to fight. One whisper, one death, one silent message at a time. They became masters of what we now call asymmetric warfare. But to them, it wasn't strategy. It was instinct, culture, survival. Their first rule, never meet strength with strength. They avoided direct combat, always. They knew they couldn't match the Vikings in open confrontation, towering men clad in iron, roaring with bloodlust. But they didn't have to, because they understood something the Vikings didn't. You don't need to beat a man in battle if you can break him before the fight begins. And so, They broke them, slowly, deliberately. False trails, decoy camps, landmarks altered so no map could be trusted, pits hidden beneath snow, paths only they could walk. And sometimes they did nothing at all. Because in this war, not appearing was often more terrifying than any attack. Their second rule, let the land fight for you. The snow, the trees, the wind, these weren't obstacles, they were allies. Where Viking ships ruled the sea, the Biamians ruled a terrain so hostile that simply surviving it was a kind of victory. Um, they moved on skis, pulled sleds with ease, knew where to find warmth, food, water, while their enemies froze, starved, wandered in circles. The Norse, who had dominated Europe, were helpless here. Their fires wouldn't light. Their feet sank. Their armor dragged them down. And worst of all, they couldn't see who was killing them. Because the Biamians didn't just kill to survive, they killed for maximum psychological impact. They targeted scouts, sentries, officers, always the eyes and ears first, then the heart, then the mind. And when they struck, they left messages. Bones arranged in symbols, runes carved into trees, figures in the snow that meant nothing but felt like curses. To the Vikings raised on glory and legacy, it wasn't just frightening, it was humiliating. No enemy to face, no battlefield to claim, no songs to sing, only whispers, only shadows, only death without a name. And still, it got worse, because the Biamians understood one truth that changed everything. Fear is a weapon, and the longer it lingers, the more damage it does. The Vikings began to crack. They spoke of voices in the wind, eyes in the darkness, footsteps that left no prints. Some swore they were fighting spirits. Others believed they were cursed. But the Biamians weren't myths. They were hunters, trained from childhood to move without sound, to kill cleanly, to disappear without a trace. The Vikings had always believed bravery meant the absence of fear. But in the frozen north, they learned something more painful. Courage isn't about lacking fear, it's about enduring it. And many could not. They fled, abandoned the mission. Some threw down weapons. Others simply walked into the snow, hoping the forest would show mercy where the ghosts had not. But there was no mercy, only a war that whispered instead of screamed, a war that haunted instead of conquered, a war that never ended because it never began in the way they understood. The Biamians had no empire, no interest in plunder. They fought because they had to, because their snow-covered world was worth defending, not with armies, not with monuments, but with silence. And that silence, it proved more deadly than any sword. In time, the Vikings stopped returning. The legends began to change. Even treasure couldn't tempt them. Furs, ivory, amber, not worth the price of fear, because every man who entered the forest came back different, if he came back at all. This was the power of silent warfare. It didn't conquer the body, it conquered the mind. And in doing so, it made even the fiercest warriors of the Viking age realize one truth. Some battles aren't meant to be won. They're meant to be survived. There are battles carved in stone and sung through centuries, fields soaked in blood, empires won or lost in a day. And then there are battles too terrible to remember, so devastating, so humbling, that silence becomes the only memorial. The Vikings called it the Battle of Sleeping Fires, and they never spoke of it again. It began not with blood, but with confidence. King Olaf of Norway, once a fearsome warrior, now a Christian king, was determined to tame the last pagan frontier. He had heard the whispers, the legends of the white forests, the stories of ghost tribes and disappearing warriors. But Olaf was not a man easily shaken. He had fought kingdoms. He had converted warlords. He believed in steel, in God, in fire. So in the spring of 1026, he gathered his army, 15 longships, 500 men in crusading zeal, to do what no Viking had ever done, conquer Biamiand. They sailed past glaciers and rocky coasts, pushed through ice-packed waters, villages emptied before their arrival, fires still smoldering, food left uneaten. To Olaf, it looked like fear. To the Biamians, it was bait. They made camp near a great lake, unknowingly stepping into a snare woven with silence. At dawn, scouts spotted a settlement across the water, longhouses, smoke drifting from hearths, rooftops glittering like gold. Olaf smiled. This was it. The heart of the ghost tribe. Their temple, their treasure. He ordered the attack. 10 ships crossed the lake, sails high, blades ready. They didn't know. The island was empty, a decoy, a mirage, crafted from bark, bone, and glittering mica to mimic wealth, a trap, and the moment they landed, the lake exploded. Flaming arrows rained from the trees, tipped with tar-like resin that burned on water and flesh alike. Greek fire had never reached this far north, but the Biamians had invented their own version. Ships ignited. Chainmail-clad warriors dove into freezing waters only to sink like stones. Those who reached land found only death. White-cloaked phantoms rising from tunnels, blades flashing, then vanishing again. From the far shore, Olaf watched his army burn. He sent reinforcements. They too were consumed, because this battle had been calculated in silence, for weeks, maybe months. And now, with terrifying precision, it began. Retreat was impossible. The Vikings' only escape, a narrow river behind them, was now blocked by felled trees. The lake burned ahead, the forest screamed with drums and ritual chants, and the sky turned red as the sun fell. But that wasn't the end, only the beginning. Dawn brought mist. At first, the Vikings welcomed it, cover for retreat. Then the coughing began. Eyes burned, throats seized. Men collapsed, choking and vomiting blood. It wasn't fog. Um, it was poison. The Biamians had harnessed sulfurous gases, crafted clouds of sulfur dioxide from specific woods and minerals. The Vikings had no defense. Strength meant nothing when you couldn't breathe. Panic spread. Some fled into the lake, others clawed at their skin, and Olaf himself collapsed, coughing blood. He survived, but he would never be the same. That night, the forest came alive. Hundreds of Biamians emerged, drums like thunder. Torches at the tree line, shadows at the edge of sight. The remaining Vikings could do nothing, only watch the trees close in. And then, silence. The Biamians didn't finish them. They didn't have to. They let the survivors crawl away, broken, poisoned, humiliated. Of Olaf's 500 men, fewer than 60 returned. And Olaf, the king who once ruled by sword and scripture, would cough blood for the rest of his life, haunted by the silence that consumed him. What made this battle so terrifying wasn't just the tactics. It was the realization that Viking power had limits, that brutality wasn't enough, that faith wasn't enough, that fire wasn't enough. Because the Biamians weren't trying to win a war, they were trying to make war unthinkable, and they succeeded. Never again would a Norse king invade the White Forests. Even the mention of Biamian chilled the blood of seasoned warriors. Sailors whispered of the sleeping fires, where men burned, where mist choked, where trees watched and snow swallowed you whole. A new fear entered Viking hearts, not of swords, not even of death, but of disappearing, of being unmade. Because the Biamians didn't just kill warriors, they killed the myth of Viking invincibility. And in doing so, they won something far greater than any kingdom. They won the right to be left alone. In the Viking world, power had a shape. It was forged in iron. It wore a beard. It roared in battle. From boyhood, Norse men were taught that the world was theirs to take, by sword, by strength, by will. Leadership was earned in blood. Honor was won by action, and those who commanded did so through masculine force. Women, while respected in certain roles, keepers of the hearth, landowners, priestesses, were rarely seen on the battlefield. Rarely seated at war councils, rarely listened to when blood was in the air. The shield wall was not a place for women. And yet, in the forests of the north, the Vikings met something they could not explain. They met women who did not ask for power. They already had it. The Biamians lived differently. Their world was born of cold, silence, and survival. And in that crucible, strength evolved. It did not favor muscle alone. It favored wisdom, intuition, and clarity of vision. And in such a world, women rose, not as exceptions, not as anomalies, but as equals. To the Vikings, it was heresy. To the Biamians, it was harmony. Biamian women led hunting parties. They negotiated trade. They settled disputes. They spoke with spirits. They held the dead. They stood between the world of flesh and the world of ice and shadow. They were not merely women. They were sorcerers. The Vikings called them witch queens, death sisters, storm callers. And when they saw them, white-haired, faces marked in symbols, cloaked in fox and snow leopard, they did not laugh. They did not scoff. They hesitated. And in that hesitation, something ancient shifted. Because the Norse had always fought what they could name, what they could understand. These women, They were outside the frame of their myths. Accounts from Norse survivors speak of women who rode ahead of ambushes, commanding without shouting, moving warriors without speaking. One saga tells of a tall woman, silver tattoos, bone carved bow, who pierced a Viking chieftain's eye from behind, two shield bearers. Another merchant recalls a Biamian elder, her face lined with blue ink, who refused to trade with liars. She bit coins to test their silver. And when a Norseman tried to cheat her, she lifted her hand, and the entire trading party vanished into the trees. The message was simple: do not mistake softness for weakness. To the Vikings, this was deeply unsettling, not because they hadn't imagined powerful women. They sang of Valkyries, of shield maidens, but those were myth, set apart, half divine, often tragic. The Biamian women were real, and they held power not through fantasy, but through presence, wisdom, and fearlessness. This created a kind of spiritual vertigo. When Viking men fell to Biamian women, many refused to believe it. Some claimed it wasn't a woman at all, but a spirit in disguise. Others whispered of pacts with demons or gifts from gods. Because to admit the truth, that a woman could lead warriors, guide souls, and kill without hesitation, was to unmake the foundation of their world. And so, denial became survival. But even denial could not stop transformation. The deeper the Norse traveled into Biamian lands, the more their understanding of power began to fray. They could not unsee what they saw, could not unknow what they experienced. And beneath the pride, some began to admire. Because the Biamian women were not cruel. They were not loud. They were calm. They commanded with silence. They protected with certainty. And in that stillness, they wielded a power the Norse had never learned to fight. The Biamians understood something the Vikings had never needed to learn. Leadership is not about dominance, it is about responsibility. It is not about who speaks loudest, but who listens longest. Not about who conquers, but who endures. Their women embodied that truth. In Biamian burial sites, archaeologists have found ritual drums, ceremonial knives, medicinal pouches, bows and arrows, carved bones used in prophecy. Objects of dual roles: the guardian, the guide, not queens by blood, not priestesses behind walls, but leaders, chosen by merit, by spirit, by the quiet approval of the land itself. And perhaps that was the most terrifying thing of all for the Vikings, that the power they had been taught to seize through violence, others had gained by being trusted. This disruption went deeper than battle. It touched belief. The Norse gods were men of war: Odin, Thor, Freyr. Even the Valkyries, fierce as they were, served male lords in Valhalla. But the Biamian spiritual world was fluid. Shamans danced in firelight, wearing masks of bone and beast. Gender blurred, species blurred, truth and myth became one. To witness a Biamian ritual was to watch. Humans become wolves, women become wind, reality becomes story. To Viking warriors already disoriented by snow and silence, this was unbearable, and yet unforgettable. Legends changed, songs shifted. The old tales of Valkyries grew less divine, less tragic, more real, because the Norse had seen it with their own eyes. Women who led with wisdom, who fought like ghosts, who healed and killed with the same steady hand. And deep down, they knew this too was strength, and it could not be ignored. Not all victories are won on battlefields, and not all legends belong to conquerors. History teaches us to measure greatness in territory, in treasure, in the names carved into stone. But there are stories, quiet ones, carried not by monuments, but by the wind, through the trees, through time. The story you've just witnessed is one of those. The Vikings have long stood as icons of strength, of war, of legacy. They burned their way into the memory of Europe: raiders, settlers, kings. They built cities, ruled seas, wrote their tales in blood and fire. But even they, with all their might, encountered something they could neither conquer nor understand. The Biamians, a people with no empire, no armies, no hunger for glory, no need for songs to remember them. And yet, when the Vikings came, armed to the teeth, hungry for conquest, they found not prey, but resistance. Not warriors to crush, but ghosts they couldn't touch. The rules of war unraveled in the cold, and the fear, so often the Viking weapon, turned back on them. Here, in the frozen forests of the far north, it was not strength that triumphed. It was silence. It was patience. It was the quiet wisdom of a people who never sought war but prepared for it just the same. The Biamians fought a different kind of battle, a war not of glory but of survival, not of domination but of preservation. And that, perhaps, is why they won. Because true power is not always about expansion. Sometimes it's about knowing who you are, where you stand, and what you will never surrender. They didn't seek to rule others. They simply refused to be ruled. They turned their environment into a fortress, their beliefs into weapons, their women into leaders, and their silence into fear. They knew they couldn't match the Viking ship for ship, blade for blade, so they didn't try. Instead, they waited, watched, listened, struck only when the forest itself tilted in their favor. They let the land speak, and it spoke with fire, with fog, with footsteps that left no trace. Even as the Norse sagas turned them into myth, witches, spirits, shapeshifters, the truth was far more human and far more terrifying. Because the Biamians didn't need to be supernatural to defeat the supernatural image of the Viking. They just needed to reveal the vulnerability hiding behind the horned helmet. And what they exposed wasn't weakness, it was limits. The Vikings believed they could go anywhere, do anything, take everything, until they reached the forest line, until they met eyes in the dark, until the snow swallowed their footsteps and gave no answers back. That is the true legacy of the Biamians, not a flag, not a kingdom, but a line drawn in the snow that even the most feared warriors dared not cross. And what's more, they did it without ever becoming what they fought. They didn't burn villages, didn't enslave, didn't build empires of bones. They protected what was theirs and asked for nothing beyond it. In a world obsessed with conquest, that kind of restraint is power in its purest form. As centuries passed, the Biamians faded, not in defeat, but in transition. Their culture absorbed, their names changed, their lands redrawn, and yet their echo remains in the forests that still carry stories, in northern rituals that whisper of eyes in the trees, in the fear that lingers even now, long after the footsteps have faded. They were never meant to be remembered in full, because their victory was never meant to be loud. It was always meant to be enough. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of story we need more of. Not tales of domination, but of defiance without destruction. Not of heroes who crush, but of people who endure. So when you next hear the stories of Viking glory, remember the ones they never told, the ones whispered around firelight with a glance toward the trees, the ones that end not with a cheer, but with silence. Because out there, in the snowbound silence of the far north, a forgotten people once stood their ground. And even now, the ghosts of the White Forest still watch. History doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers from the cold, forgotten edges of the world where no monuments stand and no songs are sung. But stories like these, the ones hidden beneath snow and silence, they matter. If this journey made you see the Viking Age differently, if it reminded you that power doesn't always come from conquest, but from understanding, then don't let the story end here. Subscribe, share it, leave a thought below. Because the past is not a dead thing. It's alive in every lesson we choose to remember. And somewhere, out in the White Forests, the Watchers are still waiting.